Will the Nintendo Switch 2 feature backwards compatibility? In the wake of rumors, leaks, and apparently this thing was showcased at Gamescom, many people are now weighing in on whether or not it will have backwards compatibility. Obviously, a big demand from consumers at this point as digital libraries continue to expand and grow. And with the success of the first Nintendo Switch hitting over 120, I believe now 129 million Switches in circulation, a lot of people have owned it and have lots of games, and they're worried, will they be able to bring those games with them? I, for one, would love to see backwards compatibility, especially if it benefits the games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom with the performance that we're hearing about. So I want to walk through the leaks, things that we're hearing. I want to talk about the earnings call, what the Nintendo president had to say, the Gamescom rumors that point to a certain style of backwards compatibility that may be happening, sort of being corroborated by what some of the leaks have said, and then also talk about the different ways that they could do backwards compatibility, because there is a variety of options. Now, if you enjoy this kind of content, make sure you hit like, make sure you hit subscribe, and leave a comment below. I'd be curious to what you think. So the leaks basically indicated that we're looking at something that's going to have roughly the same power as a PlayStation 4 or a PlayStation 4 Pro, and many people hear that and think, that's not that impressive. Those are older consoles. Why would I be excited about that? Well, they're going to be harnessing DLSS from everything we have heard, and it's giving them up to very close to a PlayStation 5 performance. What that means is you can hit higher frame rates and higher resolutions because DLSS enables them to get more out of weaker hardware. I did a little bit of research into this when I covered this for a talk show about the Nintendo Switch, the second one that's potentially on the way, and what they've been able to do with certain games like Death Stranding, able to hit around 80 FPS on 4K, so the resolution's all the way up at 4K, and then they're getting about 80 FPS on like an older video card, like a 2060, on the lower end of the graphics card. So essentially what DLSS is able to do is squeeze a whole lot more out of weaker hardware, which is ideal for a Nintendo Switch because we're very confident this is going to be another portable device. They've really carved out that portion of the market, and having that be one of the main things that you're able to offer in sort of a sea of people looking at consoles and PC gaming rigs, and with the growth of portable devices like the Steam Deck or the Asus ROG Ally, this is obviously going to be, I think, a continued theme, and Nintendo can sort of be ahead of the curve here if they're able to get this out. So that's where the leaks have really been pointing, and one of the more reliable leakers did say that backwards compatibility was already in place, but then they said for a few titles, or there were already a few titles ready to go. That sounds more like a port to me than sort of just like native backwards compatibility. The idea that like, yep, I can just play this game. So like right now on my PlayStation 5, for example, I can install and play a PlayStation 4 game. I actually installed and played the PlayStation 4 version of Elden Ring because I just got better performance, more consistent performance out of it. That game had some issues, and that was one of the things you could do to minimize that, right? Because it didn't have as much stuff going on, so it just got better performance. So that's more of like a native backwards compatible game. I can just sort of play a PlayStation 4 game on my PS5. That's not a port. That's not a remaster. That's not any kind of an update. Now, sometimes what they do is they push out an update for the game, so you do get better performance, even though it is backwards compatible. Xbox has done this with FPS Boost, and we've seen free updates for things like God of War 2018, where it got a 4K checkerboard update and 60 FPS, and then all those FPS Boost games on the Xbox saw very, very high frame rates compared to what they originally got. So that's more of a native backwards compatibility thing that might not be what we're seeing here. If there are certain games that are quote-unquote ready to go, I'm not sure if that's a native backwards compatible situation. So what we need to do now is move to the earnings call, because I do believe there is a commitment from Nintendo for backwards compatibility, and we've got this from the Nintendo president. He said the following during a sort of Q&A session. And this, I think, points to why maintaining a digital library is so important. Phil Spencer had touched on this in an interview with Kinda Funny, just about once people amass their digital library, it's really, really hard to get them to switch. And I think that's one of the reasons why Xbox really prized backwards compatibility in a lot of their marketing for this generation, because that is the expectation, that you just kind of bring everything with you. And this is what the Nintendo president said, quote, "As for the transition from Nintendo Switch to the next generation machine, we want to do as much as possible in order to smoothly transition our customers while utilizing the Nintendo account." This does seem like a pretty good commitment to backwards compatibility. It also seems to be attached to your account. Like, you'll bring your stuff with you. Now, if games have to be updated, if they need to be made backwards compatible, through like an update or something, through like a patch, well, that's something they'd be able to do at the account level. Slowly but surely, maybe that backwards compatible list of games gets larger and larger. But at the very least, I think this earnings call shows a commitment, a posture to saying we want people to transition smoothly from the Switch to this next generation machine. That's going to be hard to do if they're like me, and I got a bunch of games that I would love to bring with me. Everything from Mario Kart to Mario Party. I plan on buying Mario Wonder. That's going to feel a certain kind of way if you're buying games like Super Mario Bros. Wonder or Super Mario Bros. RPG, the remake, and then you can't bring them with you. Now, I would understand the physical versions maybe being a barrier. Maybe they're going to go to a new form. The recent leaks are pointing to actually having two SKUs. There will be a digital only, and there'll be a kind that can take the digital drive. I think mainly they're just trying to keep price down. So if they can make a bunch without that disc reader and charge a little bit less, that'll help with market saturation. We're hearing, in the neighborhood of $400 to $450. This giving them, I think, that ability there to still have that lower price entrance point, or at the very least be within the hemisphere of the other consoles that are on the market. I think the Nintendo Switch at its price point was one of its competitive edges, and that's one of the reasons it's just done so well up to now. If they're actually selling this thing on power and performance and looking better, you're going to have to do two things. I still think you're going to have to keep the price down. I think people will reasonably understand if the Switch is on the market for $299 and this thing's on the market for $399. I think that will make sense from an optics perspective of they're going to continue selling the Switch and the Switch Lite and the Switch OLED for a little while. There's usually a good amount of overlap, especially when the demand is so high for the Nintendo Switch. But beyond that, I think if they're focusing on power, they're going to have to be able to show you, hey, look at what Breath of the Wild looks like. Look at what these certain games that you had originally, look at what they looked at. And I think that's why we have to now talk about Gamescom. So allegedly at Gamescom, they showed off the Matrix demo, which looked impressive from what we've heard, as well as Zelda. And Zelda was running at higher levels of performance. And so this seems to be lining up with what we heard from the other leaker, that there's already some games ready to go. They're already ready to be backwards compatible. But again, this sounds like they may be doing some form of a port or some form of an update to make the game work, which means you might not be able to bring your entire library with you, at least not initially. Maybe there would be select games that can come up. But the Gamescom rumors were very encouraging for a handful of reasons. It sounded like it was very impressive. It sounded like it really wowed people and shocked them. But it also was exciting to hear that they had something at the level of the Matrix demo, but also that they were running Zelda at like a higher resolution and a higher frame rate, because that's been primarily what a lot of us get kind of snagged on. It's like once you're used to 60 FPS, it's really, really difficult to play at 30. I tried Tears of the Kingdom. I liked it for a little while, but as soon as I played some other games at 60 and then tried to come back to it, it was very, very difficult. Just helping my son in Kena Bridge of Spirits and then coming back to Zelda in like the same span of 10 minutes or so, it was pretty jarring. So when I heard that, I was like, that sounds great. That also lines up with the leaks. This seems then congruent with the plan to say, hey, we're committed to backwards compatibility. I think they would really, really struggle with their consumer base if there wasn't some commitment, movement, or maybe even phases of backwards compatibility where they focus on their biggest and most popular titles first. Maybe a lot of the third-party games wouldn't come up. I don't know if a game like, maybe like Snipper Clips or something, they'd be like, listen, that's a Nintendo Switch game, and it's just not going to come up. But our first-party titles like Zelda, Mario, Metroid, things like that, maybe they would get a greater priority, which that means we now need to talk about what are the ways that they could do backwards compatibility, because there are actually different approaches here. The first approach could be some form of emulation. If you've ever played a Xbox 360 game on your Xbox Series X or S, it actually boots up a 360 emulator. All of your alerts switch. It's actually kind of nostalgic to hear those old school Xbox alerts popping up, but that's essentially what it does. Everything's different once you're in there. Your dashboard, the old school messaging and all of that, it really is a step back in time. And that's essentially emulating a 360 so that you can play those games. Now, emulation is intensive sometimes. It uses up a good amount of CPU to run that, because you're essentially running the operating system and the back end and everything of another console on a console that's already running. Like it's not like it turns your Series X off and then boots it up as a 360. That'd be pretty cool if it could do that. A little bit scary if it ever got stuck in that mode, but it's not doing that. It's simultaneously running everything that your Series X needs to run, operating system and all of that, and then within that it's running another essential like instance, and it's emulating that operating system. Now, emulation is certainly possible, but I don't know if that would diminish all the returns of having DLSS and slightly stronger hardware. Would all that just get gobbled up by emulation, and then it would be pointless? It'd be like, you'd basically be just playing the original version of Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild, and that's not what we're hearing. Okay, so I don't think emulation is necessarily the course of action that they're taking. Now, native backwards compatibility is what we kind of already talked about, where I can just boot up and play a PlayStation 4 game. I don't need an update. I don't need an install. I don't need a company to come and do any porting work. I can just go into the store, and if there's a game that was only ever made for the PlayStation 4, I can do it. That's how I played Ghost of Tsushima even before the director's cut was out. It was a PlayStation 4 game. I could install it, no problem. It's just compatible from Jump Street, and that's native backwards compatibility. Now, the reason that has some advantages is it affords you the opportunity to do some of the updates that we have seen, like the director's cut for Tsushima, or FPS boost on the Xbox, or doing something like they did with God of War 2018. Those are advantages you have. You can kind of go into the game, boost it, do some updates, because you're like, hey, if this game's running on a PlayStation 5, it can tap into all this extra power. Well, the Nintendo Switch 2 could do the same thing. It's how they got FPS boost to work on the Xbox. It's like, you got extra power, utilize it. These games don't take as much, so we can squeeze a lot more from the game itself. Now, another way they could do backwards compatibility is streaming, and cloud streaming games on the Nintendo Switch has been sort of hit or miss. Some of the more graphic intensive games that have come to the Switch that a lot of us were surprised, like, how in the world did they get that game to run on the Switch? Well, some of them run on the cloud. You're basically streaming the game, it's running on another device. A lot of those games didn't review all that well. That's not the ideal situation here, and I don't think, from everything we have heard, both from the leaker as well as the people who saw Zelda running at Gamescom, nothing indicating that they're going to be doing some sort of a cloud streaming. Now, they might do that for some of the maybe less demanding games, maybe if it's a more cartoonish game, less graphically demanding, and they just want to throw it on the cloud and it works well, and they're able to give you better performance somehow. I don't know if that would necessarily be able to leverage the DLSS, because again, it would be running on the cloud on a separate device. But if you have a screen with a better resolution and better refresh rate, then it could run the game on the cloud at those settings, and then you still would benefit from having the updated hardware. Now, the last way that they could do this, and I kind of think this is where they're going to land, it's going to be native, but it's going to be a ported game. It's going to be an updated game that they have to actively go and port over, because we're talking about new hardware. We're talking about potentially sort of a new architecture for how games run, and to tap into DLSS will require an update. A great example of this is Starfield shipped without native DLSS support, and they added it later. So it's not just something that's baked into games that can just be sort of like turned on. They actually have to update them and push that out. So you're looking at games that launched on a Nintendo Switch, that the Nintendo Switch has been out since like 2017, right? So Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Super Mario Brothers Wonder. These games were not developed. Now, Mario Wonder might be because it's so close to the release of the Switch 2, but Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were likely not designed with this in mind. So they would have to go back into the game, port it, and update it, increase the ability for resolution to go up. Frames per second going up can be very problematic in games. It can cause all sorts of problems and glitches because the game was never designed to do that. So enemy animations and player animations can just break. We saw this with the Horizon Zero Dawn port to PC. So I think this is the most likely approach that they're going to take, which means not all of your games will immediately come with you. There will likely then be a backwards compatible library that grows with time. And I believe the preeminence and the prominence and priority would be given to the first-party titles like Zelda, Metroid, and Mario, which I think is a great step. I think we're probably going to have to sacrifice or lose a little to gain here. I get it. I would be frustrated if I went to my Nintendo library when this happens and a bunch of my titles didn't work. But I also understand why, what we're getting sort of necessitates it if they're going to a new hardware and a new architecture structure that grants me much better performance. Then I kind of have to take the good with the bad there. I know this is, a huge bummer to anybody who has a Nintendo Switch with a massive library, but I think the upside would be they would really only focus on the titles that would benefit the most. So your more cartoonish games or the games where it just doesn't seem as important, like Mario Party, for example. I'm happy to continue to play Mario Party on my Nintendo Switch, but Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild, newer, more graphically intensive games, I could say, hey, yeah, I want that coming over first and leveraging the power of the Switch 2. So from where I sit, the Nintendo Switch 2 will be backwards compatible, but the way it shows up and how many titles are actually compatible, well, that's a mystery that we won't know until probably sometime next year, with the rumors and the leaks pointing to the 2 SKUs launching in September of 2024. So we'll know soon, with, I imagine, some announcements after the first quarter of next year, since they said no new hardware before April of 2024. I bet you we get some kind of an announcement in April or May about this, so they can kind of get through the holiday in the first quarter, maximize Nintendo Switch saturation before they start talking about the next one, because that will decrease demand for the older device as soon as you start talking about the new one. I want to know what you think. Leave a comment below. These uploads always roll over into a members only debrief. So if you are a member or want to become a member, you can come into there and we debrief on this discussion and do some other fun things as well. If you can't do a membership, that's totally fine. You can hit subscribe and you can hit the like button, because that'll ensure that I can see you in the next video.